Rachel sat by the window, watching the soft morning light fall over the quiet street. The coffee in her hands had gone cold, but she barely noticed. Life had become too still since her husband David left for another business trip. He was good to her, always polite, always dependable, but somewhere along the way their marriage had lost its warmth. They shared the same home but lived in separate worlds. And though Rachel told herself it was normal, deep down she felt the growing emptiness. David had a son from his first marriage, Ethan, when Rachel first met him. He was 19, tall and quiet, with eyes that carried both kindness and distance. He had visited during holidays while studying in another city. Back then, Rachel tried hard to make him comfortable. She cooked his favorite meals, asked about his studies, and treated him as if he were her own. But Ethan always kept a respectful distance, polite but detached. As though unsure what place she truly held in his life, 3 years passed quickly. Rachel turned 40, David got busier, and Ethan graduated from college. When he returned home to live temporarily before finding his own place, Rachel didn't think much of it. She was happy to have someone around the house again. David was always away, and the silence of an empty home could make her feel invisible. Ethan's presence changed that. He brought life back into the house. The sound of footsteps, quiet music from his room, the clinking of dishes when he helped clean up. At first, things were simple. Rachel treated him like a guest. She cooked dinner for both of them, asked about his job search, and offered motherly advice. But something subtle began to shift, not in what was said, but in how it felt. It started one late evening after dinner. David had just left on another week-long trip. The house was quiet except for the rain outside. Rachel sat in the kitchen reading while Ethan made coffee. When he handed her a cup, their fingers brushed a small, harmless thing, but she noticed how her heart skipped. He smiled a little awkwardly, and for the first time, she saw warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. They sat together talking about small things, his plans, her work, the city, movies, and how fast life moved. Then Ethan said softly, "You're easy to talk to. I can never talk like this with my dad." His tone was honest, not flirtatious. Still, it touched something deep inside her, a quiet longing to be seen, to be heard. She had been so used to quiet meals, short conversations, and the sound of a phone ringing more than her husband's voice. Rachel tried to keep her tone light. "Your father's just busy. You know how he is," Ethan nodded. "Yeah, but sometimes it feels like I barely know him anymore." That night, after he went upstairs, Rachel sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, thinking about what he'd said. His words reminded her of herself, how she too felt unseen, like she was living next to someone instead of with them. She brushed the thought away, telling herself she was being silly. But the seed had been planted. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and Ethan grew closer in quiet ways. He'd help her fix the old porch light or carry groceries from the car. They'd talk while cooking dinner or sit together after meals when the house was too silent. It felt comforting, natural even. But sometimes, when she caught him watching her with that calm, thoughtful gaze, she felt a flicker of something she didn't want to name. One Saturday morning, Rachel was watering the small garden in the backyard when Ethan stepped out with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one and smiled. "You've kept this garden alive better than Dad keeps his plants in the office." She laughed. Well, plants need attention. Maybe he should try talking to them instead of spreadsheets. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "You make this place feel like home." The words hung in the air. Rachel felt her chest tighten. No one had said that to her in years. She smiled but looked away, focusing on the flowers as if they suddenly needed all her attention. That evening, she found herself replaying his words. "You make this place feel like home." It wasn't romantic, not directly, but it carried warmth, affection, a kind of appreciation she hadn't heard in so long. And that was what frightened her. The next day, when David called, Rachel tried to sound cheerful. She told him everything was fine, that Ethan was doing well, that the house was quiet. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the strange pull between comfort and confusion she felt whenever Ethan was around. One night, after dinner, They watched a movie together in the living room. The lights were dim, and the soft sound of rain came from outside again, just like that first evening. The movie was forgettable, but the silence between them was not. Halfway through, Ethan turned slightly toward her. "You know," he said quietly, "you've done a lot for Dad. He's lucky." Rachel smiled faintly. "I don't know about that. Sometimes I think I'm just keeping things together while he's gone." Ethan hesitated, his voice lower now. "He doesn't see how much you do." "But I do." Rachel felt her heart beat faster. She wanted to thank him, to say something, anything, but no words came. Instead, she nodded and turned back to the screen, pretending to be absorbed in the story. But she wasn't watching. Her mind was spinning. Lying in bed, Rachel couldn't sleep. The sound of the rain seemed to echo her thoughts, steady, restless, unending. She knew nothing inappropriate had happened, but she also knew something had changed. It was like standing near the edge of a cliff, aware of the danger but unable to step back. The next morning, she told herself to focus on work, to stay busy. But when Ethan came into the kitchen, still sleepy, and smiled at her like nothing had happened, she felt her heart soften again. It wasn't passion, it was connection. A quiet bond built on shared loneliness. Rachel realized then how fragile hearts could be. Sometimes love didn't appear in big gestures or loud confessions. Sometimes it crept in quietly, in the space between unspoken words, in the kindness of a glance, or the warmth of someone simply being there when the world felt cold. And though she didn't want to admit it, she felt that her life, once predictable and calm, was about to change in ways she couldn't control. That night, as she stood by the window again, watching the streetlights blur in the rain, Rachel whispered to herself, "Don't cross the line." But her heart, lonely and restless, wasn't sure where that line even was anymore. The morning sun filled the kitchen as Rachel poured coffee into 2 cups. Ethan was already there, sitting at the table with his laptop open. He smiled when she walked in, a quiet, polite smile that warmed the room. Since David had left again for another business trip, the house had begun to feel like theirs. Not in a romantic sense, but in a quiet companionship that both needed. There was laughter in the evenings, shared meals, small talks that stretched longer than either expected. Still, beneath that comfort, something deeper was growing. Something both of them felt but never dared to name. Rachel tried to keep things ordinary. She filled her days with chores, her evenings with reading. But no matter how hard she tried, she found herself noticing the small things, the way Ethan leaned on the kitchen counter when he talked, the calm in his voice, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. She told herself it was only kindness, only gratitude. But her heart knew it wasn't that simple. One evening, they were watching a movie together. It wasn't planned. He had just joined her in the living room after finishing his work. The lights were dim, and the sound of the movie filled the silence. Halfway through, Ethan asked quietly, "Do you ever think life could have gone another way?" Rachel looked at him, unsure what he meant. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, eyes still on the screen. "I don't know. Just maybe you end up somewhere different, meet someone else, and everything changes." There was a strange honesty in his tone. Rachel didn't know how to respond. She sipped her tea slowly and said, "Maybe, but I think we end up where we're meant to be." Ethan turned his head, meeting her eyes. "Do you really believe that?" Her heart skipped a beat. His voice wasn't challenging, it was searching, vulnerable. She smiled softly. "I try to." For a long time, neither spoke. The sound of rain outside filled the space between them again, the same rain that had been there on so many quiet nights before. Rachel could feel her pulse in her chest. She told herself to focus on the movie, but her mind wandered. It was an attraction, not in the usual sense. It was something gentler, sadder. A connection between 2 lonely people who somehow found understanding in each other's silence. Days passed. The feeling didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. They began to share more, not just words, but pieces of their lives. Rachel told him about her childhood. Her dreams of painting before life took her in another direction. Ethan told her about his struggles after college, how lost he felt trying to figure out his future, how he sometimes felt invisible around his father. One night he said quietly, "You make this house feel alive." Rachel felt her throat tighten. She smiled gently, unsure what to say. "It's just a house, Ethan." He shook his head. "Not when you're here." Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her teacup. She didn't want to hear that, not because it was wrong, but because it was too honest. It reached a place in her heart that had been quiet for too long. The next day she tried to create distance. She woke earlier, spent most of the day cleaning, and avoided long talks. But when evening came, Ethan noticed. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked softly. Rachel froze for a moment. "No, not at all. I've just been busy." He nodded, but his expression showed he didn't believe her. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Later that night, Rachel stood by the window again, staring at the city lights. She felt torn guilty for feeling anything at all, yet unable to deny the warmth Ethan brought into her life. For years, she had been the quiet wife, the caretaker, the steady presence in a house that rarely gave back love. And now, here was someone who noticed her, listened to her, valued her presence, someone who made her feel alive again. A few nights later, they found themselves sitting together on the porch, watching the stars. The air was cool, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of rain. Ethan broke the silence first. "Can I tell you something without you thinking I'm strange?" Rachel smiled faintly. "That depends on what it is." He hesitated, then said, "You're the only person I can really talk to. I don't know why, but I feel like you understand me better than anyone else ever has." His voice was sincere, not flirtatious, not dramatic, just honest. Rachel looked away, blinking back the wave of emotion that rose unexpectedly. "Ethan," she whispered, "I care about you, but you shouldn't rely on me like that. You're young. You'll meet people your age, people who'll understand you too." He smiled sadly. "Maybe, but right now, you're the one who does." Rachel didn't answer. The silence stretched between them, thick and fragile. She wanted to protect him from confusion and herself from guilt. But deep down, she knew their bond wasn't something either of them had planned. It had simply happened. Growing quietly in the spaces left empty by years of neglect and loneliness. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep again. She lay awake listening to the faint creaks of the old house, thinking about everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. She told herself it was only temporary, that once David came home, everything would return to normal. But she wasn't sure she wanted that anymore. The next morning she found a note on the kitchen counter. It was from Ethan. "Went for a run. Didn't want to wake you? Thanks for last night." It felt good to talk. It was simple, harmless, yet her hands trembled slightly as she read it. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something close to it, a bond built from shared loneliness. Honesty and understanding, the days ahead felt heavier. Rachel tried to pretend nothing was changing, but her heart knew otherwise. When their eyes met, there was something there, something that both longed and feared the same thing that evening. When Ethan returned from his run, he looked tired but peaceful. They ate dinner quietly, avoiding deep talk. But as he stood to leave, he said softly, "You make things feel less heavy." Rachel didn't look up. She only whispered, "That's what family does." But the word family didn't sound right anymore. It felt forced, like a wall she was trying to rebuild too late. When he went upstairs, Rachel sat at the table long after the dishes were washed. She realized how dangerous unspoken feelings could be. They didn't need to be confessed to exist. They could live quietly, breathing in every shared look, every moment of silence, every act of kindness that meant more than it should. As the clock ticked past midnight, Rachel whispered into the empty room, "Don't let this become something it shouldn't." But even as she said it, she knew the heart rarely listens to reason. And somewhere upstairs, Ethan sat by his window, thinking the same thing, wishing he could stop feeling what he couldn't help but feel. Neither of them knew what would happen next, but they both understood something had changed forever. The days moved slower after that night. The air in the house felt heavy, filled with words left unsaid. Rachel tried to focus on her daily routine, making breakfast, answering work emails, cleaning the living room. But even the simplest tasks carried a strange tension. Every time she heard Ethan's footsteps, her chest tightened. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of herself, afraid of what she was beginning to feel, afraid that her heart was wandering into a place it shouldn't go. David had been gone for 2 weeks. He called every few days, his voice distant and hurried. He talked about meetings, flights, deadlines, never once asking how Rachel was really doing. She always said she was fine, and he believed her. But in truth, she wasn't. She felt unseen, unheard. And that loneliness was what made Ethan's presence so dangerous. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed to understand her silence. He didn't push or question. He just was there helping her fix things around the house, offering quiet company, making the place feel alive again. When she came home from the grocery store, he was in the yard repairing the garden fence. When she dropped her keys one morning, he was already there to pick them up. Those small moments, simple, ordinary, carried a weight neither of them could ignore. One afternoon, it rained hard, trapping them inside. The sky was gray, thunder echoing in the distance. They spent the day cleaning the kitchen together. Rachel tried to keep things light, but when their hands brushed over the same dish, she felt a jolt. She pulled back quickly, pretending it didn't happen. Ethan noticed her reaction, but said nothing. The silence between them grew deeper, almost fragile. Later that evening, they sat on opposite sides of the couch, a movie playing quietly in the background. Neither was watching. The air was thick with unspoken emotion. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "You don't have to pretend around me," he said softly. Rachel turned her head, unsure what he meant. "Pretend what?" He looked at her for a long moment. "That you're happy. That everything's fine." She froze. His words hit harder than she expected. "Ethan," she began, but her voice trailed off. He continued, his tone calm but honest. "I see it in your eyes. You keep everything inside. You take care of everyone, but who takes care of you?" For a moment, Rachel couldn't breathe. No one had ever asked her that before. Not even David. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her emotions steady. "That's just life," she said quietly. "We all have our roles." Ethan shook his head. "Maybe, but sometimes those roles keep us from being real." The room fell silent again. The sound of rain filled the space between them, soft and steady. Rachel looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see a boy or her husband's son. She saw someone who truly saw her. Not the wife, not the caretaker, but the person beneath all that. And that scared her more than anything. She stood up, needing space. "I think I'll go to bed," she said, her voice trembling slightly. But as she turned, Ethan's voice stopped her. "Rachel." She froze. When she looked back, he was standing, his expression filled with conflict. "I know this is wrong," he said quietly, "but I can't pretend I don't care about you. You've been there for me when no one else was. You listen. You understand? You make me feel like I matter." His honesty broke something inside her. Tears welled in her eyes, not from romance, but from the ache of being seen after years of feeling invisible. "Ethan," she whispered, shaking her head, "you can't say things like that. You don't understand what it means." He stepped closer, his voice steady but soft. "I do, and I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know." For a long, trembling moment, they stood there, two people caught between right and wrong, between loneliness and longing. Rachel wanted to step back to end this before it went too far, but her heart refused to move. Finally, she whispered, "This isn't right. Ethan, you need to forget what you're feeling." He nodded slowly, eyes full of quiet pain. "I know, but feelings don't disappear just because they're inconvenient." That truth lingered in the air like smoke. She wanted to say more, to offer comfort, to fix what had already gone too far, but no words came. Ethan turned and walked away, heading upstairs without another word. Rachel stood alone in the living room, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. When she finally sat down, she felt the tears she had been holding back finally fall. The next morning was quiet. Ethan left early, saying he was meeting friends. Rachel stayed home, cleaning the same counter 3 times just to keep her mind busy. When he came back in the evening, he acted normal, polite, calm, but she saw the distance in his eyes. The house that once felt alive now felt cold again. As if they were both afraid to breathe too loudly. Over the next few days, they barely spoke. When they did, their words were short, practical. Rachel missed their conversations, but knew it was better this way. What had grown between them wasn't something that could last. It had to fade, even if it hurt. One evening, Rachel found him sitting outside on the porch watching the sunset. The sky was painted orange and pink, the air still after the storm. She joined him quietly. For a while, neither spoke. Then Ethan said, "I'm sorry for what I said." Rachel shook her head. "Don't be sorry for being honest." He turned to her, his expression sad. "But it made things hard for you," she sighed. "Life was already hard, Ethan. We just reminded each other of what was missing." He nodded slowly, looking down at his hands. "I don't regret it," he said softly. Rachel smiled faintly, though her heart ached. "Neither do I." They sat there until the sky turned dark, saying nothing more. And though the distance between them felt heavy, it was also necessary. They both knew that some connections weren't meant to be kept. They were meant to be remembered quietly, like a secret that never left the heart. That night, Rachel stood at her bedroom door, listening to the soft creak of the floor above. She knew Ethan was awake, just as she was. Both of them trapped in their thoughts, wishing things had been different. Wishing they had never crossed that fragile line between comfort and confusion. As she lay down, she whispered into the dark, "Please, let this end here." But even as she closed her eyes, she knew that some feelings, once awakened, never truly go away. They just learn to hide, waiting quietly in the corners of the heart. The house felt quieter after that night, not peaceful, but empty. The kind of silence that carried a weight. Rachel tried to convince herself that things had gone back to normal. She cooked, cleaned, and went to work as usual. Ethan stayed busy too. He had found a temporary job in the city and was gone most of the day. They spoke politely, shared short conversations at breakfast, but the warmth that once filled the house had faded. What had once been comfort was now a reminder of everything that could never be. David returned home after 3 long weeks. His usual cheerful mood filled the house for a while, but to Rachel, it all felt different. He was kind as always, but his attention was elsewhere, his phone, his meetings, his next trip. She smiled, cooked his favorite meal, and listened to him talk about business. But deep down, she felt like a guest in her own home. The connection between them was still broken, though neither wanted to admit it. Ethan stayed quiet around his father, keeping conversations short. He avoided looking at Rachel for too long, and she did the same. There was no anger, only sadness, the kind that came from understanding that something beautiful had no place in the real world. Every shared glance reminded them of what had almost happened, and of the invisible line they could never cross again. One morning, Rachel was folding laundry when she heard a soft knock on her door. Ethan stood there, his hands in his pockets. "Hey," he said gently, "can we talk?" Rachel nodded, trying to hide the nervous flutter in her chest. They stepped outside into the garden, where the spring air carried the faint scent of new flowers. Ethan looked down at the ground for a moment before speaking. "I got an apartment in the city," he said. "A friend from college found a place and asked if I wanted to move in." Rachel's hands froze. "That's good," she said softly. "You should. It'll be good for you." He nodded. "Yeah, I think it's time." They stood there for a moment, both quiet, both pretending it was just another normal goodbye. But it wasn't. They both knew that when he left, it wouldn't just be distance between them. It would be final. "When are you leaving?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning." Rachel forced a smile. "I'll help you pack," he smiled faintly. "You don't have to. I want to," she said. Her voice was steady, but her heart felt heavy. That evening, while David sat in his office on a call, Rachel helped Ethan gather his things. The process was quiet. They worked side by side, folding clothes, stacking books, packing small boxes. Every now and then their hands brushed, and each time they both froze slightly, not out of guilt, but because every touch felt like a goodbye they weren't ready for when they were done. Ethan leaned against the wall, looking around the room that had been his for so long. "It's strange," he said softly. "This place was supposed to just be temporary, but it feels harder to leave than I thought." Rachel smiled sadly. "That's what happens when a place becomes more than just walls." He looked at her, and for a moment, their eyes met, filled with everything they couldn't say. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She walked to the living room and stood by the window, watching the faint glow of the streetlights. The world outside looked peaceful, but inside her heart a storm still lingered. She thought about everything, the nights of quiet talks, the laughter, the moment they almost lost control. And how they had both chosen to stop before it went too far. It wasn't weakness. It was love in its most painful form, the kind that knows when to let go. In the early morning, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Ethan, already dressed, carrying his last bag. His car keys hung loosely in his hand. "You're leaving early," she said, trying to sound calm. He nodded. Didn't want to make it harder. Rachel nodded too, though her eyes were already misty. "Drive safe," she whispered. Safa Ethan hesitated, then set his bag down. "Rachel, before I go, I just want to say thank you. For everything. For being there when I needed someone." She smiled, though tears blurred her vision. "You don't have to thank me. You gave me something too." He looked at her curiously. "What's that?" "Reminding me that I'm still alive." For a moment, neither moved. The morning light poured through the window, soft and golden. Then Ethan took a slow step forward. He didn't hug her, didn't touch her, just looked at her with quiet affection and pain mixed together. "I'll always care about you," he said. Rachel's voice trembled. "I know, and I'll always wish you the best." He nodded, smiled faintly, then picked up his bag and walked to the door. She followed him to the driveway, the cold morning air wrapping around them. He opened the car door, paused, and looked at her one last time. "You were the first person who ever really saw me," he said softly. Rachel's throat tightened. "Go live your life, Ethan. Be happy. That's all I want." He gave a small nod, then got into the car. The engine started, the sound echoing softly in the stillness. As the car pulled away, Rachel stood on the porch, arms crossed against the chill, watching until he was gone. When she finally went back inside, the house felt larger, emptier, but lighter somehow. She walked into the kitchen, saw the empty coffee cup he'd left behind, and smiled through her tears. It was strange how something so small could hold so much memory. David came downstairs an hour later, briefcase in hand. "Ethan already gone?" he asked casually. "Yes," Rachel said quietly. "He left early." David kissed her cheek, barely noticing her distant tone. "He'll be fine. He's a good kid." Rachel nodded, forcing a smile. "He is." When the door closed behind him, Rachel sat by the window once more. The sunlight touched her face as she whispered, "Sometimes love isn't about holding on. It's about letting go before it breaks you." Her eyes glistened, but she felt peaceful. What had happened wasn't wrong. It was human. Two lonely hearts had found comfort for a moment, then chosen strength over desire. That choice, though painful, was what made it love, not weakness. Weeks passed and life moved forward. Rachel and David continued their quiet routines. She started painting again, something she hadn't done in years. The colors helped her heal shades of blue and gold that reminded her of all the emotions she couldn't put into words every now and then. When the evening light hit the living room just right, she thought of Ethan, of his calm voice, his kind eyes, and the way he had made her feel seen. But she didn't dwell on the sadness. Instead, she smiled. Knowing some stories weren't meant to be lived forever, only remembered gently, and as she stood by the window one last time, watching the world outside her home, she whispered softly, "Thank you, Ethan, for reminding me what my heart could still feel." Then she turned away from the window, ready to begin again.
Ethan Blake rushed through the glass doors of the Seattle office building, already running late and carrying the weight of a stressful week on his shoulders. and his mind was so busy rehearsing his presentation that he barely noticed where he was walking. He simply followed the hallway he always used, convinced he was heading into the conference room for the final briefing. He knocked once, heard nothing, and pushed the door open, expecting coworkers, charts, and chatter, but instead, he froze as the quiet room revealed Claire Mitchell, his boss, in the middle of slipping on her formal blazer. For a split second Ethan's heart jumped to his throat. The scene wasn't inappropriate or revealing, but it was private, unexpected, and far too intimate for a normal morning in the office. Claire spun around, eyes wide with surprise, her expression soft but startled, and Ethan instantly turned his back, muttering a flurry of apologies while wishing the floor would just open and swallow him. He hadn't meant to embarrass her, he respected her more than anyone in the building. Claire wasn't just his boss, she was the person whose leadership he admired, whose calm voice steadied the whole team, and whose kindness made even the hardest days feel manageable. Ethan had always kept his feelings hidden, locked away where no one could notice, but the look she gave him now, a look not of anger but something gentler, something he couldn't name, made the moment heavier than he expected. Claire's voice came softly, steadying the air between them. "Ethan, we'll pretend you didn't see anything, right?" she said quietly, but the words didn't sound like a warning or a stern instruction, they sounded like she needed reassurance, like she wanted to protect them both from awkwardness neither had asked for. Ethan nodded without turning, promising he'd never disrespect her, never make her uncomfortable, and she replied with a calmness that made his chest tighten. He backed out of the room, cheeks burning, and closed the door gently behind him, but the moment replayed in his mind over and over, her expression, her soft tone, the unexpected warmth in her eyes, the way she seemed more surprised emotionally than physically. He hurried into the real conference room afterward, but he couldn't focus, every slide blurred into one, every voice faded, and all he could think about was how Claire seemed less embarrassed about being seen and more affected by the unexpected closeness of the moment. Ethan wondered why she wasn't upset. Most bosses would have been, but Claire wasn't like most people. She always carried herself with calm strength, and yet in that brief instant, she seemed vulnerable in a way he'd never witnessed. As the meeting dragged on, Ethan kept catching glimpses of her at the front of the room, her voice steady, her posture perfect, but there was something different in the way she avoided his eyes, as if she was thinking about the same moment and didn't know what to do with the sudden, unplanned shift between them. And Ethan, who had always admired her from a respectful distance, now found himself wondering if she noticed him more than he thought. The day blurred as he moved through his tasks with unusual awareness, every sound in the hallway made him wonder if she was near, every footsteps behind him made his heart jump, and every quiet second reminded him of how close he had come to seeing a side of her he was never meant to see, human, unguarded, and unexpectedly real. But what truly stayed with him was not the accidental moment but the way she had spoken to him afterward, not with frustration or embarrassment, but with a gentle trust that surprised him. Most people would have been tense, annoyed, defensive, even cold, but Claire had looked at him with something that felt like respect, maybe even curiosity. She didn't accuse him. She didn't question his intentions. She simply trusted that he was the kind of man who would handle the moment with care. And that changed everything. Ethan walked home. That evening through the cool Seattle air with his thoughts spiraling faster than the city traffic, he couldn't shake the feeling that the moment wasn't just an accident, it was a turning point, something small but powerful that left an imprint he couldn't ignore. He replayed her soft voice, her steady gaze, and the strange flutter in his chest when she had said, "We'll pretend you didn't see anything, right?" It wasn't the words themselves that replayed in his mind, it was the quiet meaning behind them, the way she seemed to ask not because she feared gossip but because she cared about how he saw her. And for the first time since he started working under her, Ethan wondered if Claire, brilliant, composed, admired Claire, felt something too, something she had never allowed herself to admit. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing, whatever had shifted between them in that brief, unexpected moment had changed the entire direction of his day, and maybe the direction of both their lives. Ethan spent the rest of the day pretending everything was normal, but nothing felt normal, and every step he took around the office seemed heavier because he kept replaying Claire's voice from that morning. By afternoon, when his phone chimed with a message from her assistant saying, "Claire would like to see you," his stomach dropped, not out of fear but because he wasn't ready to face whatever feelings their moment had stirred. He walked into her office quietly, closing the door behind him when she asked, and immediately sensed the change in the atmosphere. Claire sat at her desk, but she didn't look like the confident manager everyone admired. She looked thoughtful, searching for words she wasn't used to saying. "I want to talk about this morning," she started, her tone gentle, not professional, and Ethan braced himself, expecting a warning or a strict reminder about boundaries. But she surprised him again by thanking him for how respectfully he handled the situation. She said she appreciated that he didn't panic or make her uncomfortable, and that most people would have reacted differently, maybe even turned the incident into something embarrassing. Her words struck him harder than he expected because Claire wasn't someone who admitted vulnerability often. Ethan stood quietly, listening, noticing how her fingers tapped the edge of her notebook like she was nervous, something he rarely saw. When she said, "You didn't disrespect me, and that says a lot about your character," he felt something inside him shift, a pull he tried to ignore for months suddenly becoming harder to hide. She looked at him with eyes that seemed to hold a question she wasn't saying aloud. Ethan wasn't used to being studied this closely, especially by someone like her. To break the tension, she added with a small, almost shy smile, "You've been avoiding my eyes today." He admitted it, telling her he didn't want to make things awkward, and she responded with a soft laugh, saying he wasn't the reason for the tension, her own thoughts were. That confused him even more, because bosses don't usually talk like that, not unless something deeper was happening beneath the surface. Silence stretched between them, full but not uncomfortable, and Ethan suddenly found himself wanting to understand what she was thinking. He finally asked her the question that had been sitting in his chest all day, "Claire, what exactly are we pretending didn't happen? The moment? Or the way we looked at each other?" She froze, her breath catching in a way that told him the question hit deeper than he intended. She looked away, and for the first time, he saw her unsure of her own feelings. Claire wasn't someone who ran from challenges, she normally faced things straight on. But now, she sat quietly, avoiding his eyes, like she was afraid that answering honestly might change something she wasn't ready to change. When she didn't respond, Ethan realized she wasn't ignoring him, she was struggling to find the right truth. That silence spoke louder than any explanation. He could see the way her shoulders softened, the way her breath trembled just a little, the way she finally lifted her eyes to him with a softness that stirred both hope and fear inside him. She didn't have to say it, he felt the shift, the unspoken acknowledgement that the moment meant something to her too. Before either of them could continue, someone knocked on the door, asking for a file, breaking the moment like someone had dropped a stone in still water. The spell between them faded just enough for both to straighten up, return to their roles, pretend everything was professional again. But when the door closed, Ethan could still feel the emotional trace of the moment hanging in the room like quiet electricity. She dismissed him soon after, telling him she had another meeting, but her eyes lingered on him when he turned to leave, eyes filled with questions, hesitation, and a hint of something tender. As Ethan walked back to his desk, the world around him seemed to move too fast, while inside him everything slowed down. He felt confused yet hopeful, nervous yet drawn to her even more. He replayed every small detail, the way she said his name, the softness in her voice, the unspoken message behind her questions, the silence that had felt strangely intimate. For the first time since working under Claire, Ethan realized she wasn't just a mentor or a distant figure he admired, she was a human being with emotions she kept hidden beneath her strong exterior. A human being who maybe, just maybe, felt something that scared her as much as it scared him. That evening, as he walked out of the building and into the cooling Seattle air, he couldn't shake the feeling that something between them had changed forever. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that broke rules or crossed lines, but in a quiet emotional shift that opened a door neither of them expected to touch. It wasn't about the moment he accidentally walked in on, it was about everything that moment revealed: trust, vulnerability, curiosity, and the start of a connection neither of them knew how to name yet. And though neither said it out loud, Ethan knew Claire was thinking the same thing he was, that once a door like that opens, pretending nothing happened becomes nearly impossible. The days after that conversation felt different for Ethan and Claire, even though they both tried to act normal at work. small gestures, lingering glances, and subtle changes in their tone made the office feel charged, as if every moment carried more meaning than it should, and Ethan noticed it immediately, his heart racing every time Claire approached his desk or smiled his way. The simple sight of her walking past him stirring feelings he had kept buried, feelings that were growing stronger with every interaction. They spoke more freely, conversations drifting from work to personal stories, sharing music they loved, books they read, and memories from their pasts, and in those moments, Ethan felt closer to her than he had with anyone else in years, realizing how rare it was to connect with someone who understood both your mind and your emotions. One evening, after the office emptied early due to a sudden power outage, Ethan stayed behind, finishing reports under the dim emergency lights, when he saw Claire step into the room with 2 cups of coffee, her casual approach breaking the tension of the quiet office, and he felt an unexpected warmth at her thoughtfulness, realizing she noticed him in ways she never had before. "Thought you might need this," she said softly, placing a cup near his hand, and the gesture was simple, but in that moment, it felt intimate, a signal of care he hadn't expected from his boss, someone he had admired but never imagined could notice him personally. They talked for hours, the city lights shining outside the windows, their conversation meandering effortlessly, filled with laughter, quiet reflections, and moments of shared understanding, and Ethan felt the boundaries between professional and personal blur in the most gentle way possible, nothing inappropriate, just human connection that stirred his emotions deeply. As the night deepened, Claire confided in him in a way she never had with anyone else, admitting her worries about caring too much for someone she worked with, her voice barely above a whisper as she expressed her fear that noticing him too deeply could lead to complications, yet she couldn't hide the warmth in her eyes, the small smile that betrayed her feelings despite her caution. Ethan listened, not moving closer, respecting the space, but feeling his chest tighten with each word, realizing that this was a moment of trust and vulnerability she was giving him, something that went beyond office boundaries, something that said she saw him differently than anyone else. He responded with quiet honesty, telling her it wasn't wrong to feel emotions, especially when they were real, and she looked at him then, really looked, as if seeing someone who could understand her without judgment, and it made the air between them charged with unspoken tension, a delicate dance of restraint and longing. But before either of them could go further, the sudden ring of her office phone snapped the moment, forcing them both to retreat to their usual roles. She answered professionally, and he instinctively stepped back, realizing how fragile this connection was, how quickly it could be interrupted by the routines of work life, yet even in that professional shift, the emotion lingered, leaving them both aware of a bond that had quietly grown. The next days were a mix of excitement and restraint, every interaction, every brief smile, every passing comment held new weight. Ethan noticed how Claire's attention seemed to find him in meetings, her eyes following him just slightly longer than before, and he found himself analyzing every small gesture, wondering what they meant, and realizing that he was no longer just an employee in her eyes, but someone who mattered to her beyond work. The awareness of mutual feelings, unspoken yet clear, created a constant tension that was thrilling and terrifying at the same time, and it forced both of them to confront emotions they had never allowed themselves to explore in the context of office life. One afternoon, Ethan caught her looking at him when she thought he wasn't noticing, her expression soft, a mixture of curiosity and hesitation, and he realized she was battling the same questions he had been, about boundaries, appropriateness, and the unpredictable pull of attraction that felt impossible to ignore. Their connection deepened quietly, through shared glances, small conversations in empty hallways, and moments of unspoken understanding that made ordinary workdays feel extraordinary, and Ethan felt his admiration for her grow into something more tender, something that carried the weight of emotion he had never expected to experience in the office. And then one evening, as they were both still working late, Claire admitted something that took him by surprise. She trusted him in ways she trusted no one else, that she felt a vulnerability around him that she didn't allow with others, and the honesty of her words struck a chord deep in his chest, making him realize the depth of their connection and the delicate balance they were navigating. He responded in kind, quietly assuring her that he would never take advantage of her trust, and in that mutual understanding, something profound shifted. It was no longer just admiration or respect, but a recognition that both of them felt more than friendship, more than professional regard, but were afraid to fully name it. Yet before they could explore these feelings further, reality intruded, work responsibilities, the boundaries of professionalism, and their own caution reminded them to step back, to pretend for the moment that nothing had changed, even though everything had. Ethan left the office that night with a mix of exhilaration and longing, aware that the line between respect and emotional intimacy had been crossed subtly but permanently, and he knew that the challenge now was to navigate this new emotional terrain without losing the trust and respect that had always defined their relationship. The quiet acknowledgement of feelings, the shared moments of vulnerability, and the tension of unspoken attraction became a delicate thread running through their days, binding them together emotionally while maintaining the necessary professional decorum, and Ethan realized that this connection, once accidental, was now something neither of them could ignore or easily undo, setting the stage for a deeper, more honest chapter of their lives. The next morning, Claire asked Ethan to meet her on the rooftop terrace, a place she rarely used, and when he stepped onto the open space, he saw her standing with the Seattle skyline behind her, the wind tugging gently at her coat and hair, making her look both strong and vulnerable at the same time, and his heart skipped as he realized this was a moment she had intentionally created, a space away from the office where they could speak freely without interruptions or pretense. She greeted him softly, and though she tried to act calm, there was a tension in her posture, a hesitation in her voice that told Ethan she was about to say something important, something she had carried for days since the first accidental morning in her office, and he felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness, unsure what her words would mean for both their personal and professional lives. Claire took a deep breath, and as she spoke, she began with honesty, telling him she owed him the truth about what had happened, explaining that the incident had embarrassed her, not because of anything inappropriate, but because it made her confront her own feelings and vulnerability in a way she hadn't expected, and that hearing his name, seeing his reaction, and observing his respect made her realize how much she trusted him and how deeply she cared for him emotionally. Ethan listened intently, each word sharpening his awareness of her sincerity, and he felt his chest tighten, realizing that the bond they had been slowly building was stronger than either of them had admitted, that it had grown in the quiet moments, the shared glances, the unspoken understanding, and the late-night conversations that had brought them closer without crossing professional lines. She admitted that her embarrassment stemmed from caring what he thought of her, from fearing that he might judge her moment of vulnerability, and Ethan understood immediately because he had felt similar doubts about her perception of him, and the mutual acknowledgement of these feelings created a fragile but undeniable intimacy between them, a connection built on honesty and trust rather than impulsive attraction or fleeting emotions. He stepped slightly closer, keeping his distance respectful, and told her that she didn't have to be strong all the time, not with him, and when he said that, her eyes softened, glimmering with relief and something tender that neither of them had expressed aloud before, and it was in that moment that Ethan realized their emotional bond had reached a point where fear of judgment had given way to hope and trust. Claire continued, confessing that she was scared because noticing him so deeply and feeling so much was new territory for her, that she wasn't sure how to navigate the unexpected pull of emotions without compromising professionalism, and Ethan's response was steady, calm, and full of reassurance. He told her that feeling deeply wasn't wrong, that acknowledging emotions was human, and that their connection could be cherished without fear if approached with honesty and care. The wind moved gently around them, carrying the city sounds far below, and in the quiet space of the rooftop, their hearts aligned in an unspoken understanding, the tension of weeks of avoidance and hesitation melting into clarity, leaving room for emotions they had both felt but never fully named. Claire's words grew more vulnerable, as she admitted that the morning incident and their shared moments afterward had made her realize she could trust him in a way she had trusted no one else, that her admiration for him as a colleague had shifted into something tender and personal, something she didn't know how to define but couldn't ignore. And Ethan felt the weight of her honesty and the depth of their connection in a way that made him feel seen and understood more than ever before. He matched her vulnerability with his own honesty, telling her that he too had felt the change, the subtle shift in their interactions, the slow burning of emotions that were impossible to deny, and that he had hoped she felt the same way, even if neither of them had said it outright until now. Claire's eyes filled with a quiet light, a mixture of relief, hope, and nervous anticipation, and she whispered that she didn't want secrets or pretense between them anymore, that the honesty they shared now was the only way forward, and that she liked him, but she didn't know where it would lead, yet she was tired of pretending nothing had changed. Ethan's chest tightened with emotion, and in that moment, he spoke the truth he had carried quietly for weeks, telling her he felt the same, that her feelings mirrored his own, and that he didn't want to hide or ignore the bond they had built, that it was real and meaningful, and he wanted to explore it honestly, carefully, and with respect. Claire's relief was evident. She closed her eyes briefly, letting herself exhale the tension she had carried, and when she opened them, there was no fear, no hesitation, only a gentle hope that whatever came next could be shared without guilt or uncertainty. They didn't need dramatic gestures or grand confessions. The emotional honesty between them was enough to transform the rooftop terrace into a space where vulnerability, trust, and mutual affection existed side by side, and Ethan felt a deep connection that went beyond admiration or attraction, reaching into the territory of true emotional intimacy, where two people see each other fully and still choose to stay close. In those final moments before leaving the rooftop, they stood quietly together, not touching, but connected in a way that words couldn't fully capture, their eyes meeting, their breaths synchronizing, and both of them understood that this was the start of something new, a story that had begun accidentally but was now real, deliberate, and mutual, a story of trust, respect, and emotional courage that would define the next chapter of their lives. The city skyline faded into evening lights behind them as they finally walked down together, side by side but not hurried, carrying the shared knowledge that their bond had shifted irreversibly, that they no longer had to pretend nothing happened, and that for the first time, both of them could embrace the beginning of their feelings with honesty, excitement, and hope for what the future might hold. And in that quiet, tender way that only real connections can create, they understood that their story had truly begun, not with drama or impulsive gestures, but with vulnerability, trust, and the courage to finally admit what had been growing between them for weeks.